I want to start with the smell. I know that's a strange way to open a story like this. A story about companies and lawsuits and regulatory filings and men in conference rooms signing documents that changed everything. But every time I go back to the beginning in my mind, that's what hits me first. The smell of hospital antiseptic and cafeteria soup and whatever industrial cleaning product they use on linoleum floors that never quite works, that never quite gets rid of the underlying smell of sickness and exhaustion and the particular kind of grief that settles over a place where people are waiting to see whether someone they love is going to be all right. I was 17 years old the first time I understood what money actually was. Not what it could buy. Not comfort or status or the things I watched other kids at school carry around like flags. The right sneakers, the right car in the student parking lot, the right casual indifference that came from never having to think carefully about anything. I understood what money was before and after. The line between having enough and not having enough. The specific, very concrete way that line determined what happened to you when your body stopped working correctly. Oliver taught me that, not because he wanted to, not because he said anything about it. My brother was never someone who talked much about what he was going through, even when what he was going through was the kind of thing that would have made most people scream. He taught me by being sick, and by being sick in a way that cost money we didn't have, and by watching our mother work herself towards something that looked a lot like collapse, trying to cover the gap between what we had and what he needed. That's where this story starts, not in a boardroom, not with a handshake or a contract or a moment of calculated triumph. It starts in a school hallway in a mid-sized Ohio city on a Tuesday in October, with my twin brother standing at his locker, looking thinner than he should have been, and a boy named Kyle Prescott saying something about natural selection and something cold taking root in me that would take over a decade to fully grow. We were born 11 months after our parents married. Oliver first, then me, 3 minutes later, which was how it always was between us. He was first. I was catching up. That dynamic defined a lot of things about who we became, though neither of us would have named it that way at the time. Our father left when we were 9. I don't say that for sympathy, it's just context. He was there, and then he wasn't, and our mother, Angela, recalibrated everything around that fact with a quiet efficiency that I didn't fully appreciate until I was much older. She worked as a pharmacy technician at a regional drug chain, the kind that has 12,000 locations and pays its hourly employees just enough that they can't easily afford to leave. She was good at the work. She understood medications, interactions, dosing schedules. She talked to customers with the kind of genuine attention that most people in that position never bother with. She knew the names of their children. She asked about their conditions. She remembered what they'd told her 3 months earlier. She was paid $11.40 an hour for all of that. We lived in a house that my grandmother had left to her, a 3-bedroom ranch on a street where the cars in the driveways were mostly more than 10 years old, and the lawns were kept up out of stubbornness and pride rather than convenience. It wasn't poverty, technically. We had food and heat and a working television and school supplies, and the specific kind of competent frugality that meant we didn't feel poor most of the time. Angela was careful with money the way surgeons are careful with instruments. Precise, deliberate, nothing wasted. Oliver and I were, by any measure, normal kids. We played the same video games everyone else played. We argued about the same things. We had the same arguments with our mother about homework and curfews and the general organization of our lives. He was quieter than me, more methodical. I was faster to decide, less careful about consequences. We balanced each other in the way that twins sometimes do, filling in the spaces the other left. I was 15 when Oliver got diagnosed. The name of the disease is long and largely unpronounceable to anyone who hasn't spent significant time in medical literature, which I have since become. It's a rare autoimmune condition, the kind where the body's immune system, which is supposed to protect you, turns on specific tissues instead, attacking them with the same systematic thoroughness that makes the immune system so effective against actual threats. In Oliver's case, the primary targets were his joints and certain connective tissues. The early symptoms looked like athletic injuries, soreness, swelling, stiffness that was worse in the mornings. The doctors at our local clinic initially treated it as such, which cost us months that might have made a difference in the progression. By the time they got the correct diagnosis, Oliver had already lost significant function in 2 of the fingers on his right hand, the right hand. He'd been left-handed his whole life, which felt like one of those small mercies that the universe occasionally offers without explanation. The treatment protocol was established and effective. That's the clinical description. What it meant in practice was a specific class of injectable biologics administered every 3 weeks, indefinitely, with quarterly blood work and semi-annual specialist visits, plus a constellation of supporting medications and physical therapy sessions. The biologics alone cost at that time approximately $4,000 per injection without insurance. 12 injections a year, $48,000 annually, not counting anything else. I was 15 years old, and I did that math in the parking lot of the hospital after the specialist explained the treatment plan to my mother, and I understood for the first time what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a number. Angela had insurance through her employer. Of course she did. The pharmacy chain was large enough to be required to offer it, and she'd taken the most comprehensive plan available, which cost her nearly a third of her take-home pay in premiums. The plan covered 60% of specialist-approved treatments after a deductible that reset every January. 60% of $48,000 is $28,800 covered, leaving $19,200 per year in patient responsibility for just the primary medication. Divided by 12 months, that was $1,600 a month. Not counting the quarterly blood work, not counting the specialist visits, not counting the supporting medications or the physical therapy. $1,600 a month from a woman making $11.40 an hour. She didn't tell us right away how bad it was. She kept her face carefully neutral through the first weeks after diagnosis, the way she did when she was working through a problem internally before she was ready to talk about it. But I was 15, not 5. I watched her start a second job, overnight shifts, stocking shelves at a grocery store 2 nights a week. I watched her stop buying coffee at the gas station in the morning, which had been her one indulgence for as long as I could remember. I watched her have a quiet, controlled conversation on the phone with someone from the bank about a home equity line of credit, and I watched her face after that call when she thought no one was looking. I started working the summer before sophomore year, not because anyone asked me to. Angela would have argued against it if I'd asked her permission. I found the job on my own, AWE. Night shift unloading delivery trucks at a warehouse distribution center on the edge of town. They paid $14 an hour, which was $3 more than anything I could find elsewhere, and the night shift differential added another 75 cents on top of that. I could work 4 nights a week and still make it to school without failing out if I was disciplined about it. I was disciplined about it. I'm not saying this to establish myself as virtuous. I'm saying it because the discipline that I learned in those years, the capacity to perform under conditions of sustained exhaustion, to make clear decisions when my body wanted nothing except sleep, to maintain a long horizon when everything around me was immediate and grinding, became the most important professional asset I would ever develop. The warehouse taught me that. The work itself was simple. What it demanded of you was not. I gave most of my earnings to Angela. She accepted it without ceremony, which told me everything I needed to know about how much it was needed. We didn't talk about it. It was just what we did. Oliver didn't know for almost a year, and when he found out, he didn't speak for the rest of that evening, and the next morning he told me he was going to pay me back, and I told him to stop being an idiot, and we never discussed it again. What I'm describing sounds like hardship, and it was. But I want to be accurate about what that hardship felt like from the inside, because I've noticed that people who talk about poverty or financial strain tend to describe it one of two ways, either as a constant state of despair or as a noble struggle that builds character. Neither of those captures it correctly. What it actually felt like was a kind of permanent, low-grade arithmetic. Every decision had a number attached to it. Every choice was made relative to other choices. You developed a very precise understanding of what things actually cost, not what the sticker said, but what the full consequence of buying or not buying something was. You stopped being abstract about money. It became concrete, specific, real, in a way that I think is actually quite difficult for people who've never experienced that kind of pressure to fully understand, even if they're trying. This is relevant. It's relevant because the boy who would become my primary point of reference for the next 15 years of my life had never, not once, experienced money as something concrete or real or consequential in any way, and that difference between understanding money as a system of real consequences versus experiencing it as an abstraction that generated comfortable conditions was at the root of everything that happened between us. Kyle Prescott transferred into our school at the start of junior year. I say transferred, but that's not quite right. He'd been attending a private school in a suburb 30 miles away, and his parents had moved, or more accurately, his father had relocated the regional operations of his company, and the family had acquired a house in our school district, and Kyle Prescott had arrived as a consequence of that logistics decision. He arrived the way wealthy children sometimes do, with complete assurance that his presence would be received as an asset. He wasn't wrong. That's the uncomfortable truth about people like Kyle Prescott. They're not wrong about how they'll be received, because the social systems of American high schools are remarkably good at identifying and rewarding the markers of status. Kyle was tall, conventionally attractive in the way that required minimal effort, effortlessly coordinated in the particular way that suggested a lifetime of expensive sports instruction. He drove a black Audi A4 that his father had purchased for him as a matter of course rather than celebration. He wore clothes that were subtly but distinctly different from what other people wore. Not flashy, not ostentatious, just consistently and specifically better in ways that were immediately legible to everyone, even if no one could have articulated why. He was also smart, which was worse. Not intellectually serious. He had no patience for anything that required sustained engagement or genuine uncertainty. But he was quick and perceptive and had the particular social intelligence that consists of identifying, immediately and instinctively, where power is in any room and how to align himself with it. He could read groups the way I could read numbers, and he could talk, fluently, confidently, with the easy authority of someone who had never been in a room where his opinion wasn't welcomed. Within 3 weeks of arriving, he was at the center of things. Lunch table, sports team, the invisible but very real hierarchy of social permission that governs American high schools. He made it look effortless, which it probably was for him. I noticed him the way you notice something that might become a problem, not with particular hostility at first, more with the careful attention of someone who has learned, through experience, to identify what kind of thing something is before deciding how to relate to it. The first thing I heard him say about Oliver was in the hallway near the science wing, the first week of October. Oliver had been having a difficult stretch. One of his joints had been inflamed for 2 weeks. The new dosage adjustment was still settling in, and he was moving more slowly than usual, not dramatically. You wouldn't have noticed if you weren't paying attention, but Kyle Prescott was paying attention, in the particular way he always paid attention, which was looking for things that could be organized into narratives that served him. "What's his deal?" I heard him say to Harrison Langston, who was one of his new satellites. He was looking at Oliver walking ahead of us in the hallway. "His brother," Harrison said. "He's got some kind of disease, autoimmune thing." Huh? A pause. Then, with the specific casual cruelty of someone who has never had to think carefully about what his words cost, Natural selection, I guess. I heard it clearly. I was 3 feet behind them. I kept walking. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about this. I was afraid of what I would say if I started, and I was afraid that what I would say would make things worse for Oliver, and I was tired in the specific way that comes from months of working night shifts and watching your mother's face when she thinks no one is looking. I swallowed it. I stored it. I kept walking. That was the first time. The second time was at a school assembly in November, when a local insurance industry representative came to talk to juniors about career paths. The representative was there as part of some corporate education initiative, the kind of thing that happens in schools without anyone questioning whether it's actually educational or primarily promotional. Kyle Prescott asked a question during the Q&A that sounded on the surface like a legitimate business question about claims management, but which was actually, if you were paying attention, a very pointed statement about the legitimacy of denying coverage for expensive treatments. It's a business, he said, clearly and with confidence. Insurance is a risk management product. It's not charity. If a condition is too expensive to cover at a sustainable rate, the actuarial math doesn't work, and the system breaks down for everyone. He said it with the comfortable certainty of someone who had grown up hearing these arguments around dinner tables as an established moral framework rather than a contested position. He wasn't performing, he genuinely believed it, which, I would come to understand much later, made him both more and less dangerous than if he'd been consciously cruel. I sat in that auditorium and listened to him explain, in the practiced vocabulary of someone trained from childhood in the language of risk pools and actuarial tables, why it made structural sense for people like Oliver to receive less coverage than they needed. And around me, other students nodded with the vague agreement of people who don't know enough to disagree. And the instructor said something about interesting perspectives. And Kyle Prescott sat down with the satisfied expression of a person who had performed competently in a context that mattered to him. I found out 6 weeks later, through documents my mother didn't know I'd seen, that the Prescott family's insurance holding company was the underwriter for our school district's employee coverage plan, which meant that Kyle Prescott's family company was the one that had determined the coverage terms under which Oliver's treatment was being handled, which meant that the people making actuarial arguments about sustainable risk pools at the dinner table were the same people who had calculated the exact formula by which my brother's medication costs were divided between covered and not covered. I'm not going to pretend I processed this rationally in that moment. I was 17. I processed it the way a 17-year-old processes, discovering that something abstract and systemic has a specific human face, with a kind of concentrated fury that had nowhere to go, that I had to immediately and deliberately compact into something I could carry without it showing. I carried it. I got better at carrying it, but the weight never changed. The third incident was the one that closed something in me permanently. It was January of junior year. Oliver had been doing reasonably well. The new dosage was holding. The inflammation had stabilized, and he'd had a stretch of 2 months where things felt almost manageable. He'd started drawing again, which he did in the careful, detailed way he did everything, small geometric patterns that he filled in with colored pencils during free periods. He'd been doing it since middle school. It was the thing he went to when everything else was difficult. Kyle Prescott saw him in the library during a free period. Oliver had his sketchbook out, working on something, and Kyle walked past with 2 of his group and stopped. I wasn't there. Oliver told me about it that night, sitting on the floor of his bedroom with his back against the bed, the way he sat when he needed to talk about something, but didn't want to make it a conversation you had to look directly at each other for. Kyle had looked at the sketchbook. He'd said, in a loud enough voice for the surrounding tables to hear, that it was interesting that Oliver was spending time on art instead of, say, figuring out how to not be a drain on the system. He'd said it with the particular framing that let him claim if challenged, that he'd been making a broader point about resource allocation. He'd smiled while he said it. Oliver hadn't responded. He'd closed the sketchbook, gathered his things, and left the library. He didn't tell a teacher. He didn't tell our mother. He told me, that night, in the careful, flat way he had of describing things that had hurt him without wanting to perform that hurt for someone else's benefit. I sat with him for a while after he finished talking. Then I went to my room, and I sat at my desk, and I did something I had never done before. I looked up Kyle Prescott's family business. Prescott Insurance Holdings, established 1987 by Kyle's grandfather, expanded aggressively through the 90s and early 2000s under his father's leadership. 7 subsidiaries, operations in 14 states, a portfolio that included employer group plans, individual market products, and several specialty lines, including the plans sold to regional school districts in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. Annual premium revenues of approximately $2.3 billion at their most recent public filing. Market capitalization that I couldn't fully process as a number that had any relationship to anything real. I read for 3 hours. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know enough then to know what would eventually be useful. I was just reading because reading was how I processed things that were too large to process any other way, and because there was something in me that was insisting even then that understanding the system was the only way to eventually do anything meaningful within it. I went to school the next day and did not say anything to Kyle Prescott. I went to my warehouse shift that night and unloaded trucks for 6 hours. I came home at 4 in the morning and laid down for 2 hours before my alarm went off. I carried it. I kept moving. And something in me that had been a kind of open question about what I was going to do with my life quietly became a decision instead. I should tell you about the mistake, because this story isn't complete without it, and because I think it's the part of it that I have spent the most time with in the years since. The mistake happened in the second semester of junior year. I had been managing my night job and my coursework and the ongoing arithmetic of our household finances with what I thought was reasonable competence. My grades were good, my work was reliable. I had developed, out of necessity, an extremely efficient relationship with sleep and time that allowed me to function across an extended period at a level of performance that surprised even me. What I hadn't developed was the ability to recognize when I was making decisions from exhaustion rather than from reason. There was a scholarship, a significant one, $15,000 annually, renewable for 4 years, from a regional foundation that supported first-generation college students pursuing careers in healthcare. I was legitimately competitive for it. My grades were strong, my personal essay was honest and specific about my situation, and I had a genuine and demonstrable interest in healthcare systems that had emerged from living through Oliver's diagnosis and treatment. I made it to the final round of consideration, the interview stage, held on a Saturday morning in the offices of a downtown law firm that managed the foundation's administration. I had worked a shift the night before. I told myself I would sleep for 3 hours between getting home and the interview. I set the alarm for 6. When the alarm went off, I looked at it for a moment that turned into 20 minutes, and then I was up and showering and telling myself I was fine. I was awake. I had done harder things than this. I was not fine. I was not fully awake. I sat in that interview room across from 3 adults who were trying to determine whether I was the kind of person who could sustain a demanding educational and professional path. And I answered their questions in the careful, considered way I always answered questions. And 3/4 of the way through, I stopped hearing the last part of one of their questions and answered something adjacent to, but not quite what had been asked. The interviewer paused. She repeated the question. I understood it the second time and answered it correctly, but the pause had happened, and I watched the 3 of them process it in the way that people process something that creates a small but definite uncertainty. I didn't get the scholarship. I found out 2 weeks later, through a form letter, that thanked me for my application and wished me success in my future endeavors. I sat with that letter for a long time. $15,000 per year for 4 years was $60,000, which was a number that mattered enormously to what the next 4 years were going to look like for me, and by extension for my mother and Oliver. I had been close. I had been in the final room, and I had made an error not of preparation or intellect or qualification, but of logistics, of failing to protect the specific conditions I needed to perform well because I was managing too many things at once and had misjudged one of them. I tell this story because that's what a real mistake looks like. Not a dramatic choice you make from a recognizable moral position. A structural error in how you allocated a finite resource, in this case, sleep, that compounded in a specific way at a specific moment. The lesson I took from it was not that I needed to work less hard or need less from the world. The lesson was that resource allocation, of money, of time, of energy, of sleep, was a serious technical problem that deserved the same rigor I was trying to apply to everything else. That protecting the conditions of performance was itself a form of work, not an indulgence. I applied to 6 other scholarships that spring. I received 2 of them, which covered roughly 40% of what the missed one would have provided. I adjusted the rest of my plans accordingly. I did not let myself be angry about the lost scholarship for more than one evening. Anger at your own mistakes is usually just another form of the same error, recycled. The isolation came gradually, the way most important things do. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I don't want to make it sound like I was uniquely solitary or that I suffered in some particularly dramatic way. I had Oliver. I had, in the way that people working alongside you in difficult conditions create something that functions like community, the other people on my warehouse shift, older men and women with their own complicated arrangements, who were working nights for reasons I mostly didn't know, but recognized as analogous to my own. I wasn't alone, but I was, in the specific social context of being 17 and 18 in an American high school, increasingly apart from the experiences that most of my peers were having and the concerns that occupied them. This isn't a complaint, it's a description. When your primary concerns are medication costs and shift schedules and financial aid applications, you don't have the same conversational access to the things that most of your classmates are thinking about, and they don't have access to yours. Not because of malice on either side, just because experience creates language, and different experiences create different languages, and translation is difficult. I watched from a specific distance how Kyle Prescott and his social world organized itself. I watched because I had learned to watch carefully, and because I had decided that understanding was not something I could afford to skip steps on. He was popular in the way that people with real resources and real social intelligence are popular, not because everyone liked him, but because everyone understood that he was consequential. Teachers treated him with a certain careful consideration. Students oriented toward him and away from him in patterns that I could map as clearly as I could map the routes through the warehouse at night. He moved through the social environment of the school with the ease of someone who had been trained to move through that kind of environment since birth. He wasn't uniquely cruel, I should say. He wasn't a movie villain. He was a specific type of person, someone whose beliefs about fairness and desert, and who deserved what had been formed in an environment that had never seriously challenged them, shaped by a family business that had very particular incentive structures, and equipped with enough intelligence and social skill to present those beliefs confidently and fluently. He thought of himself as realistic. He thought of himself as clear-eyed about how systems worked, as opposed to sentimental or naive. He wasn't performing cruelty. He was expressing a worldview. That, I think, is what made him dangerous in a way that a simpler person wouldn't have been. The last conversation I remember having with him in high school happened in May of senior year. 2 weeks before graduation. We had ended up in the same corner of the school parking lot by coincidence. He was waiting for someone. I was on my way to my car, which was a 12-year-old Honda Civic that Angela had acquired from a neighbor for $1,500 and which ran with stubborn reliability, despite its aesthetic limitations. He looked at my car, and then he looked at me, and he said something that he intended as a joke, something about how I'd probably appreciate a reliable vehicle, given everything, said with the specific inflection of someone who has learned to deliver condescension in the packaging of humor. Then he got into his Audi and drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, then I got into my Honda and drove to my shift. I didn't think about Kyle Prescott again for almost 2 years after that. I was too busy. I had too much else to do, and anger is a fuel that burns through things you need for other purposes if you keep it lit, constantly. I put it somewhere, and I went to work. I went to a state university on a combination of scholarships, federal aid, and a loan that I calculated very carefully before I signed for it. I had gotten into better schools. I had not been able to afford better schools, and I had done the math too many times to pretend otherwise, so I didn't pretend. I studied biomedical sciences with a concentration in pharmaceutical sciences. I want to explain why, because it's not quite as obvious as it might seem given my history. I wasn't choosing it out of some linear narrative of revenge through expertise. I was choosing it because it was the field where I understood, from direct experience, what the real problems were and where the leverage points for addressing them might be. I had spent 3 years watching Oliver's treatment protocol, watching the biologics work, watching them cost what they cost, watching what happened when dosage adjustments were required, watching the interaction between medication effectiveness and coverage gaps. I had an understanding of the real problems in pharmaceutical access that most 18-year-olds studying biomedical sciences did not have, and I knew that understanding was potentially worth something. I was also, I should admit, drawn to the technical difficulty. I needed the work to be hard enough that there was no part of my attention left over for anything that wasn't the problem directly in front of me. Biomedical sciences, done properly, is that kind of field. The material is dense and demanding and rewards the specific kind of sustained attention that I had been developing in warehouses and at kitchen tables at 2 a.m. with borrowed textbooks. It asked things of me that I had things to give. I was not especially social in college. This is not something I look back on with regret exactly, though I understand what I missed. The people I spent time with were primarily people I worked with in labs or on problem sets, relationships built around shared technical work rather than shared social experience. I had a roommate my freshman year, Isaac Chambers, who was studying materials engineering and who had a similarly compressed relationship with leisure time. We got along on the basis of mutual respect for efficiency and the silent agreement that conversation was a resource to be deployed strategically. He's still one of the few people I would call a genuine friend, though we went years without speaking at stretches. I worked through college the way I had worked through high school, though the night shifts were replaced by research assistant positions and eventually lab work that paid modestly but offered the additional currency of experience and access. I called Angela every Sunday. I called Oliver every Wednesday. He had, by then, stabilized considerably on his treatment. The medication was working, the disease was manageable, if not resolved, and he had built a life around its constraints with the methodical acceptance that was his characteristic approach to everything. He was working as a graphic designer, doing clean, precise work that had found a small but consistent market. He was not happy in any uncomplicated way, but he was not unhappy. He was living. Angela was tired. That was the honest description. She was managing, and she was good at managing, but the years of double shifts and careful arithmetic had the specific quality of wear that doesn't show in any single moment, but accumulates into something visible only if you knew someone well enough to compare against a baseline. I could see it because I knew her baseline. I carried that too. Let me tell you something about what it's like to work nights and go to school days, because I think the reality of it is different from how most people imagine it. People imagine exhaustion, and yes, the exhaustion is real, a specific kind of grinding fatigue that becomes so familiar that you start to mistake it for your baseline. But the thing that most people don't understand is that the exhaustion is also a teacher, not in a motivational poster sense, in the very specific sense that a body and mind operating under sustained load develops adaptations that a rested person doesn't develop. I learned in those years how to identify the minimum viable version of any task, how to strip a problem down to its essential structure without the usual scaffolding of rereading and note-taking and the slow elaboration of understanding that is available to someone with 4 uninterrupted hours. I learned how to read something once and retain it, not because I was gifted in that direction, but because reading it twice was a luxury I often couldn't afford. I learned how to function in meetings or lectures after 4 hours of sleep and still extract exactly what I needed from the experience, because failing to do so had concrete consequences that I could not absorb. These skills are worth more in professional life than any formal credential I've ever received. They are also, I should be clear, not something I would recommend that anyone develop under the conditions I developed them. The cost of learning that way is not trivial, and there were months in those years when I was genuinely uncertain whether I was managing the situation or whether the situation was managing me. The thing that kept me on the right side of that line, most of the time, was Oliver. Not in the sense that he was an inspiration. I'm wary of that framing because it tends to treat disabled and sick people as objects of narrative utility for the people around them, which Oliver would have found both accurate and irritating. What I mean is something more direct. Oliver existed, and Oliver needed his treatment covered, and that was a fact that didn't respond to my exhaustion or my self-pity or my desire to just stop running the arithmetic for 1 week. The facts were the facts. The arithmetic was the arithmetic. I did the arithmetic. There is a particular clarity that comes from necessity. Not a pleasant clarity. It's not the clarity of meditation or good sleep or resolved questions. It's the clarity that comes from having the margin removed from your decision-making. When there is only one acceptable outcome, the number of things you spend time and attention on contracts significantly. You become very efficient. You become very specific about what matters and what doesn't. You stop having opinions about things that don't bear on anything real. I carry that clarity with me still, years later, in conditions that are nothing like those early years. It doesn't go away. You don't unlearn the capacity to find the essential structure of a problem once you've spent years having no other option. You just gain the luxury of also being able to consider the periphery. In my junior year of college, I had a conversation with a professor. I'll call him Dr. Thornton because I respect his privacy and because his actual name doesn't matter to the story, who was running a research project on biologic manufacturing costs. He was looking at the gap between what it actually cost in materials and process and capital to produce a biologic treatment and what the market charged for it. The gap, in most cases, was not a small rounding error. It was a structural feature of the market, built through patent protection and regulatory capture and pricing strategies that bore essentially no relationship to the underlying economics of production. I sat in his office for 2 hours that afternoon and came out with the beginning of an understanding that would take me another 5 years to fully develop. That the problem with pharmaceutical access was not primarily a medical or scientific problem. It was a market design problem. And market design problems could be solved if you understood them thoroughly enough and had the right resources and the right leverage points and the patience to work at them from the right direction. I went back to his office the next day with 3 pages of questions. He looked at them for a moment and then told me I should consider pursuing a combined degree in pharmaceutical science and business. He said it in the tone of someone identifying, somewhat reluctantly, a resource that might become inconvenient later. I applied for the combined program the following week. I was accepted. I recalculated my timeline and the financial implications and adjusted accordingly. I graduated 4 years later with a deep technical understanding of how biologics were designed, produced, regulated, and priced, and a thorough working knowledge of the business structures through which those processes were organized. I had also, by that point, developed a specific and detailed understanding of the rare autoimmune disease category, its treatment landscape, and the particular manufacturing and regulatory inefficiencies that kept effective treatments priced far above what the underlying economics required. I was 23 years old, and I had a plan that was coherent enough to talk to people about, which meant it was time to start talking to people about it. I want to be careful not to make this sound cleaner than it was. What I had at 23 was not a business plan. It was a direction and a set of questions I knew how to begin answering, and a very clear sense of what problem I was trying to solve and why it mattered. The distance between that and a functioning company was enormous, and I knew it was enormous, and I started covering that distance the only way I knew how, which was to show up every day and do the specific thing that was in front of me to do. I took a position at a small biotech firm in Cincinnati, not a prestigious firm, not a large one, a 10-person operation that was working on a monoclonal antibody project for a different therapeutic area entirely, but which gave me access to the manufacturing process and the regulatory pathway and the working reality of what it actually took to move a compound from research to clinical trial. I spent 2 years there, working every hour they would pay me for and several hours they wouldn't. I read everything I could find about the specific target area I was interested in. I built relationships with researchers who were working in adjacent spaces. I applied for every grant and fellowship that was even tangentially related to what I was trying to do. I want to describe this period more carefully, because I think there's a version of this story in which 7 years of professional development collapses into a single sentence about hard work and discipline, and that collapse misses what actually happened. What actually happened was much more specific and much less linear. The first year after graduating, I was at the Cincinnati biotech firm, a company called Elara Therapeutics that no longer exists, having been acquired by a larger firm in 2019. What I learned there was not primarily about the science, though I learned science too. What I learned was what a development organization actually looked like from the inside, how decisions were made, what they were made on the basis of, where the points of leverage were, what happened when a study didn't produce the expected result, the human and organizational texture of the work, which no classroom fully captures. I also learned, in my second year there, what happens when a company's financial situation changes in ways that aren't publicly visible. I watched the organization contract, slowly then quickly, as a Series B financing that had been expected failed to materialize. I watched how that kind of financial pressure changed the decisions that got made, about which projects survived and which didn't, about which people stayed and which people were quietly let go. It was an education in the relationship between capital structure and scientific direction that I could not have gotten any other way. I left at the end of year 2 with a clearer understanding of exactly what kind of organization I was trying to build, and, critically, what kind I was not trying to build. The 7 years between leaving Elara and the founding round of Meridian were spent acquiring, as deliberately as I could, each of the pieces I knew I needed: deeper technical knowledge in the specific therapeutic area, industry relationships that were based on genuine mutual regard, rather than on networking performance, a track record of judgment that would give potential investors reasons to believe me when I described what I intended to do. The rebuilding phase, which is what I call it in my own private accounting, took 7 years. 7 years from the day I graduated to the day I sat across from an investor, and described, with enough confidence to be credible, a company that would develop a more effective and significantly more affordable biologic therapy for a category of rare autoimmune diseases that included Oliver's condition. 7 years of accumulation, of knowledge, of credibility, of relationships, of the specific kind of professional track record that allows you to walk into a room and be taken seriously about what you're saying you can do. I made mistakes in those 7 years. I went down research paths that didn't work. I had a partnership negotiation that fell apart badly enough that I spent 3 months reconstructing the parts of the project that had depended on it. I misjudged once the regulatory timeline for a preclinical study and had to revise my investor projections in a way that cost me one of my early supporters. I learned from all of it the way you learn from things when you can't afford not to. Completely, immediately, permanently. What I built was real. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because nothing in what follows makes any sense if you think what I was doing was primarily, or even significantly, about Kyle Prescott. The science was real. The problem was real. The patients were real. I had been watching one of them my entire life, and I knew with complete clarity what a more effective and affordable treatment would mean in concrete terms for people like him. The company I was building was built to solve a real problem, because solving a real problem was the only foundation that would hold. The other thing, the fact that the solution to this real problem would, structurally and necessarily, put me in a position of leverage relative to the specific industry that had shaped Kyle Prescott's worldview and funded his life and determined what happened to my brother's coverage. That was not the purpose. It was a consequence. And I was patient enough and clear-headed enough by then to understand the difference. It took me 7 years to be ready, and then I was ready, and I started building. The company was called Meridian Biotherapeutics. I chose the name deliberately, not for any symbolic reason, but because it was precise. A meridian is a reference point, a line from which you measure. That was what I was trying to build, a reference point for what was actually possible in this space, technically and economically, when you stripped away the assumptions that the market had calcified into common wisdom. The founding team was 3 people: myself, a synthetic chemist named Dr. Morgan Sterling, who had published foundational work in biologic synthesis optimization that the larger companies had largely ignored because it came from outside the established academic lineage, and a regulatory specialist named Dr. Sebastian Caldwell, who had spent 11 years at the FDA before moving to private practice consulting. We had complementary knowledge and complementary blind spots, and we were honest enough with each other about both to function as a real team rather than a polite coalition. We raised a seed round of $4.2 million. This sounds like a lot until you understand what it actually costs to get a biologic compound from early research through a phase 1 clinical trial, at which point it sounds like a starting position rather than a conclusion. We spent it with the discipline of people who understood that every dollar of capital had a measurable opportunity cost, and that running out before the next milestone was not an option we could allow for. The science took 5 years. Not 5 years of continuous crisis. There were stretches of months where things proceeded exactly as we had projected, and the work was simply the work, demanding and detailed, but not dramatic. And there were stretches where we hit problems that required genuine rethinking, where Morgan came to me with data that contradicted our model, and we spent 3 weeks going back to first principles to understand why. The problems were real problems, and solving them required real science, and I can tell you from the experience of living through it that there is no more effective education than the education you receive from a problem that doesn't care what you need the answer to be. By the end of year 2, we had a compound that was demonstrably more effective than existing therapies in the target category across our in vitro work. The mechanism was different. We were targeting a different point in the inflammatory cascade than the existing biologics, which had the effect of both improving efficacy and significantly reducing manufacturing complexity. That second part was, from a business perspective, as important as the first. The manufacturing cost reduction we were projecting, if it held through clinical scale-up, would put us in a position to price the treatment at a fraction of what existing therapies cost, not because we were choosing to sacrifice margins, but because our actual production economics were structurally different. I brought Oliver in at this stage, not as an investor. He had no money to invest, but as a scientific advisory panel member, which was a formal role with a modest stipend attached. What I wanted was his perspective, not as a patient, but as someone with 20 years of direct experience with the disease category we were targeting. He came to one meeting per quarter. He looked at our efficacy data and asked questions that were precisely the right questions, because he understood from the inside what the disease did, and therefore understood in a concrete way what improvements in efficacy meant and what they didn't mean. He was invaluable in ways that no amount of clinical data could fully replicate. He never asked me why I had chosen this area. He knew, and I knew he knew. And we had the same understanding about it that we'd had about my warehouse wages when we were 17. The understanding that some things don't need to be named to be acknowledged. We closed a Series A of $18 million in year 3. This was when things began to change in terms of how the company existed in the world, how it was perceived by the industry, how it was talked about in the specialized media that covered biotech development, how it appeared in the peripheral vision of larger companies who tracked the development pipeline. We moved into a larger facility in Columbus. We expanded the team to 47 people. We initiated a Phase 1 clinical trial that, by the end of year 4, had produced safety data that was exceptionally clean and preliminary efficacy, signals that were, by any objective reading of the data, remarkable. I was 31 years old, and I had not thought about Kyle Prescott in years. That's the truth. I'm aware of how the narrative logic of a story like this might suggest that he was always somewhere in the background of my thinking, a motivating force I was constantly calibrated against. That's not what it felt like from the inside. What it felt like from the inside was working, specifically, relentlessly, on a set of problems that demanded my complete attention, within a company that was becoming real in ways that continually generated new demands on that attention. The origin story was what it was, and I carried it, but it wasn't what I saw when I looked at the problem directly in front of me. I saw the problem. He came back into my awareness through data. I was reviewing market access research for our commercial planning, understanding the insurance landscape for the therapy category we would be entering, identifying which major insurers had established formulary policies for comparable biologics, modeling what our coverage environment was likely to look like at launch, and there it was, in the insurance coverage database, Prescott Insurance Holdings, still operating, larger now, with an aggressive formulary management strategy that was specifically noted in industry analysis for its restrictive stance on high-cost specialty biologics. The strategy had a formal name in their annual report, value-based formulary design, and it meant, in practice, that they required extensive prior authorization documentation, imposed significant step therapy requirements, and maintained high patient cost-sharing tiers for specialty medications, which was language that meant that for people with conditions like Oliver's, accessing treatment through Prescott-managed plans required months of bureaucratic navigation and still left patients with annual out-of-pocket costs that many of them could not sustain. Kyle Prescott was now the CEO of the company his father had built. The transition had happened 2 years earlier. He was 31, same as me, which I noted with the specific attention of someone who had always tracked where he was relative to me on the implicit timeline of becoming something. His company had the second largest employer group plan market share in Ohio, which meant that when Meridian's therapy entered the market, the decision of whether to include it in coverage, and at what tier, and with what prior authorization requirements, and at what patient cost-sharing level, would be made in part by Kyle Prescott's organization. The man who had said natural selection in a school hallway would have structural authority over whether people with conditions like Oliver's could access the thing I had spent a decade building. I sat with that for exactly one evening. Then I began planning. I want to be precise about what the planning involved, because I think precision matters here. I was not planning revenge. I was planning market entry strategy, which is what any company in our position would have been doing at that stage of development. The difference was that I had an unusually detailed understanding of the specific failure modes of the restrictive formulary model, and an unusually clear-eyed view of the multiple leverage points available to an effective therapy with strong clinical data and favorable production economics. The fact that Prescott Insurance Holdings was one of the entities that used that model, and that its CEO was someone whose relationship to the problem I understood very specifically, sharpened my focus but did not change the substance of what I was doing. The strategy had three components. Each was legitimate, each was effective, each produced consequences that were entirely foreseeable from the beginning. The first component was government partnership. Rare autoimmune diseases have significant advocates in the federal policy space, partly because the patient populations are highly organized, and partly because the regulatory pathway for rare disease therapies involves specific programs: orphan drug designation, accelerated review tracks that create points of engagement with federal healthcare policy. I had been building relationships in that space for years, not as a political strategy, but as a basic requirement for navigating the regulatory process. By the time we were approaching commercial launch, I had meaningful working relationships with people at multiple federal agencies and with congressional staff who worked on healthcare policy issues. The government partnership component involved formalizing those relationships into something with more structural permanence: contracts for participation in federal employees' health benefits programs, formal collaboration on access research, and, most significantly, inclusion in a new CMS initiative for rare disease treatment access that carried formulary requirements for participating insurers. Any insurer that wanted to participate in certain federal programs would need to demonstrate adequate coverage of CMS-designated treatments. We worked through appropriate channels and over an appropriate timeline to have Meridian's therapy designated as a reference treatment for the target indication. This took 2 years and required sustained engagement with the regulatory process that I was equipped to do because I understood that process in detail. When the designation came through, it meant that insurers operating in the federal space, including Prescott Insurance Holdings, which had significant federal employee plan contracts, faced regulatory pressure to include the therapy at coverage levels that were specified in the designation criteria. The second component was distribution infrastructure. Specialty biologics have specific distribution requirements: cold chain management, specialized pharmacy networks, patient support services for injection training and monitoring. Building a parallel distribution infrastructure that bypassed traditional pharmacy benefit manager channels was expensive but strategically important. It allowed us to establish direct patient access programs that could reach patients without insurance coverage or with inadequate coverage, which served multiple purposes. It was the right thing to do for those patients. It generated real-world outcomes data that strengthened our coverage arguments with insurers, and it established a baseline of patient access that demonstrated, concretely, what adequate coverage should look like. The direct access programs were funded through a foundation structure, the Meridian Patient Access Foundation, which I had established at the company's founding with a commitment of 7% of any future equity proceeds. This was not a charitable gesture bolted onto a commercial strategy after the fact. I had structured it in at the beginning, which meant it was as much a part of the company's financial architecture as any other element. It operated independently, with its own board and its own criteria, and it funded treatment access for patients who couldn't afford their cost-sharing obligations, even with insurance coverage, as well as patients who lacked coverage entirely. The direct access programs were funded through a foundation structure, the Meridian Patient Access Foundation, which I had established at the company's founding with a commitment of 7% of any future equity proceeds. This was not a charitable gesture bolted onto a commercial strategy after the fact. I had structured it in at the beginning, which meant it was as much a part of the company's financial architecture as any other element. It operated independently, with its own board and its own criteria, and it funded treatment access for patients who couldn't afford their cost-sharing obligations, even with insurance coverage, as well as patients who lacked coverage entirely. The board of the foundation included a patient advocate named Aaron Blackwood, who had been navigating the rare autoimmune disease landscape for a decade. As a patient herself, as an organizer, as someone who understood from the inside what the gap between coverage and access actually looked like in practice. She had been doing the work before we funded any of it, and she continued doing it with the specific efficiency of someone who doesn't need to be told twice what the problem is. She ran the Foundation's Patient Services Division with a combination of systemic thinking and individual attention that I found genuinely instructive. There was a period, about 8 months into the Foundation's formal operations, when we were processing more applications than our original projections had anticipated. This was both a validation and a challenge. Validation because it confirmed that the need was as large as I had estimated, and a challenge because larger than expected volume required decisions about prioritization that we hadn't needed to make when the volume was lower. Aaron brought the prioritization framework to me as a formal proposal, a tiered criteria structure that balanced clinical urgency, financial hardship, and geographic access gaps. We spent 3 days going through it, line by line, arguing over edge cases. I kept pushing her to be more inclusive. She kept pushing back on my projections about available funding. We ended up somewhere neither of us had started, which is what serious institutional design looks like when the people doing it are both capable and honest. That framework, which we've revised twice since, now governs coverage decisions for thousands of patients annually. It's not my framework, it's Aaron's framework, improved by argument. That's how the best institutional work gets done. The third component was what I privately called the audit strategy, though that framing doesn't quite capture what it was. Insurance companies are heavily regulated entities. They are required to maintain specific reserve ratios, to demonstrate actuarial soundness in their pricing, to comply with state and federal coverage requirements. They are subject to examination by state insurance commissioners, and for the federal programs they participate in, by federal agencies. They file public documents, annual statements, actuarial, certifications, rate filings, that contain substantial information about their financial position and their compliance with regulatory requirements. I spent 3 months reviewing Prescott Insurance Holdings' public filings before I found the first anomaly. It was in their reserve calculations, specifically in the methodology they used to estimate claims liabilities for their specialty drug benefit. The methodology had a specific structural feature that had the effect, across a large book of business, of systematically understating reserves in a way that improved their reported financial position. It was not fraud, not exactly, or at least not obviously so. It was a modeling choice, one of many places where actuarial judgment created discretion that happened to consistently benefit the company's reported solvency ratios. I hired a forensic accounting firm. This is not a cheap or quick undertaking. The engagement took 8 months and cost $240,000. What they produced was a 300-page technical analysis of Prescott Insurance Holdings' actuarial methodology, financial statement presentation, and claims management practices, with specific reference to the reserve calculation issue and 3 other areas where their practices appeared to deviate from regulatory standards in ways that were systematic rather than occasional. I submitted the analysis to the Ohio Department of Insurance's Examination Division through appropriate channels as a formal complaint from a market participant with standing to raise coverage concerns. I also submitted the relevant sections to the federal agencies responsible for oversight of the federal programs in which Prescott participated. I did not call Kyle Prescott. I did not write him a letter. I did not announce any of this in any public forum. I did not tell Oliver I was doing it. I did not speak about it to anyone outside the forensic accounting firm and my legal counsel. I submitted the documents, and then I went back to work. The regulatory response to the submission took 14 months. I did not expect it to be fast. Regulatory processes are not designed for speed. They're designed for thoroughness, which is what I needed them to be. In those 14 months, I continued building the company, managing the commercial launch of our therapy, expanding the foundation's reach, and developing the government partnership component of our strategy. The commercial launch was a significant event, not because of what it meant to me personally, though it did mean something in ways I'll get to, but because of what it demonstrated about what was actually possible in this market. We priced the therapy at 62% below the leading existing biologic in the category. This was not a loss leader pricing decision or a strategic sacrifice. It was what the therapy actually cost to produce, plus appropriate margins for R&D recovery and ongoing innovation investment, plus a meaningful profit margin. The production cost advantage from our manufacturing process innovation was that substantial. The existing market price was not based on production economics. It was based on what the market had demonstrated it would pay. The clinical data was strong enough that the coverage arguments were hard to resist. Our Phase 3 results showed statistically significant superiority to standard of care on the primary endpoints, with a safety profile that was as clean as our Phase 1 data had suggested. When those results were published, we had a period of about 6 weeks during which the pharmaceutical and biotech press covered our work extensively, which created a specific kind of visibility that is difficult to generate any other way. Oliver called me the morning after the first major article ran. He didn't say anything particular about the therapy's relevance to his condition. He said, "You did it," and I said, "We're still doing it," and he said, "Yeah," and that was the conversation. But I could hear something in his voice that I had not heard since before his diagnosis. Something that was not quite optimism, because Oliver didn't really do optimism, but was adjacent to it. Something that was the recognition that what had been fixed was not necessarily fixed forever, that systems could change, that the specific configuration of who had power over whom could be different than it had been. I held on to that. The formulary negotiations with insurers were complex and extended. Most of the major insurers engaged seriously once our data was published. They had patients who would benefit, and they had fiduciary obligations that included providing access to effective treatment, and the pricing made the cost-effectiveness argument substantially more straightforward than it had been for our predecessors in the category. Prescott Insurance Holdings was different. Their initial response to our formulary submission was a prior authorization requirement that was, by any reasonable measure, designed to function as a barrier rather than a clinical management tool. They required 18 months of documented failure on 2 prior biologics before they would authorize our therapy, which meant that patients on their plans would spend 18 months on treatments that were demonstrably less effective before they could access ours. The clinical logic of this position was essentially zero. The financial logic was clear. Every month of delay reduced their cost exposure. I responded through 3 channels simultaneously. Our patient advocacy partners filed formal coverage complaints with the Ohio Department of Insurance. Our legal team filed a formal dispute under the federal parity and access requirements, and I expanded the Foundation's direct access program to ensure that patients on Prescott-managed plans who were denied authorization could access the therapy through the Foundation while the dispute worked through regulatory channels. The Foundation didn't announce this as a response to Prescott. We announced it as an expansion of our commitment to patient access. Both things were true. The regulatory examination of Prescott Insurance Holdings began formally 9 months after I submitted the forensic accounting analysis. The examination team was thorough. They confirmed the reserve calculation issue and identified additional compliance concerns in their rate filing processes for specialty drug benefits. The formal findings resulted in a consent order that required Prescott to revise their reserve calculations, restate their financial position accordingly, and implement compliance improvements across multiple functions. The restatement changed their reported financial position in ways that mattered to their debt covenants and credit ratings. When those ratios moved, their borrowing costs increased. When their borrowing costs increased, their operational margins compressed. When their operational margins compressed, they faced pressure from their investors and creditors that hadn't previously existed. This is the nature of financial leverage. It doesn't require violence or drama. It requires finding the point where the numbers connect to other numbers and understanding what happens when one set of numbers changes. I had spent years understanding exactly that. The federal coverage dispute created additional complications for their federal program participation. When federal regulators found that their prior authorization requirements for our therapy were inconsistent with the access standards in the CMS designation framework, they faced a choice: revise the coverage requirements or exit the federal programs. Exiting the federal programs would cost them $340 million in annual premium revenue. They revised the coverage requirements. Let me tell you something about the moment when power reverses, because I think it's not what most people picture. There is no dramatic scene where someone looks across a table and understands for the first time that they are on the losing side of a calculation they thought they were winning. The reversal happens in the data, in the filings, in the shift of who returns, calls first, and who has to wait. The human experience of it, the actual moment when the person on the wrong side of the ledger understands their position, is usually much quieter and much more private than the version that plays out in fantasy. I know this because I watched it happen through the evidence it left, rather than through any direct observation. Kyle Prescott, I learned through industry reporting, had personally led the internal team trying to manage the regulatory response. He had brought in outside legal counsel and external consultants, and had spent 6 months, according to people who worked in adjacent spaces, and sometimes talked to people I knew, in the specific kind of organizational difficulty that comes from managing multiple simultaneous regulatory pressures while your financial position is deteriorating. He had aged, reportedly, in ways that were visible to his staff. He had become, by accounts, difficult to work for in the specific way that people become difficult to work for when they are afraid. I did not read those accounts with satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. What I felt when I encountered information about his situation was something closer to a very quiet and entirely joyless recognition. The kind of recognition you get when something you understood theoretically turns out to be true in practice. Not pleasure, just the specific, flat accuracy of having been right about how something worked. The first investor consortium approach to Prescott Insurance Holdings came in month 22 of the formal regulatory process. 3 private equity firms, operating through a coordinated acquisition vehicle, made an offer for a controlling stake in the company at a valuation that reflected their current financial difficulties, a significant discount to where they'd been trading before the regulatory issues began. The existing shareholders, who had seen 20% of their equity value evaporate over the prior 18 months, were receptive in the way that investors become receptive when the alternative is watching the remaining 80% continue to decline. Meridian Biotherapeutics' investment portfolio held, through an independent vehicle that had been established 2 years earlier, positions in 2 of the 3 firms that composed the acquisition consortium. These positions were disclosed in all required regulatory filings. They were entirely legal. They were exactly what they appeared to be: investments in companies that were doing interesting work in the healthcare market infrastructure space. The acquisition closed in month 28. The new investor consortium took control of Prescott Insurance Holdings. Kyle Prescott was removed as CEO as part of the governance restructuring that accompanied the change of control. He received his contractual severance package, which was substantial in absolute terms, but was, relative to what he had expected his life to look like, a rounding error. The board positions he had occupied on his family company and several affiliated entities were gone. The staff he had led for 4 years were now reporting to people who had come in with the new investors. His name would remain on the company building's marble lobby for several more months, until the rebranding was complete, which is a specific kind of indignity that anyone who has thought carefully about legacy will recognize as precise. I was not in the room when any of this happened. I was in Columbus, in a meeting about our Phase 2B data for a second indication in the target autoimmune category. I heard about Kyle Prescott's family situation indirectly about 18 months after the acquisition closed. One of the patient access coordinators for the foundation, a woman named Valerie Chambers, who managed the central case review process for the Ohio region, mentioned in a routine status call that they had processed an unusual application, a relatively young man in the Cincinnati area, applying for foundation coverage for a family member's treatment. The case was unusual because the applicant had declined to complete the income documentation section of the application, which was required for the foundation's means-tested programs. After some follow-up communication, the documentation had come through, and it had revealed a financial situation that was significantly more constrained than the applicant appeared to have expected, given whatever his previous relationship with money had been. She wasn't telling me this as a specific case. She was giving me a general picture of the kinds of applicants the foundation was seeing. She moved on. I didn't ask. Questions. I didn't know it was Kyle Prescott. Not then. I found out later, through a chain of information that I won't reproduce here, because the specifics don't matter, and because the person whose relative was receiving treatment had not consented to have their situation discussed. What I will say is that when I found out, I sat with it for a long time, and what I felt was not what I had imagined I would feel. I had imagined when I was 17 and standing in a school parking lot watching his Audi pull away, that there would be some version of satisfaction, some completion, some sense of scales balancing. I don't think I had articulated it that specifically, but the feeling I was anticipating was something clean and definitive, a closing. What I actually felt was something far more complicated and far quieter, something that I didn't have precise language for at the time, and still struggle to describe accurately. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't pity exactly, though. There was something in that direction. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you've proven a theorem that you were confident was true. There's a quality of recognition, of confirmation, but the confirmation doesn't change the underlying facts in any direction. The world is what it is. The theorem was true before you proved it. Now you just know with certainty instead of with confidence. His family member received the treatment. The foundation's approval process was exactly what it was for every other applicant. Case review, documentation, clinical eligibility, financial eligibility, approval, and enrollment. No special consideration in either direction. I did not intervene to accelerate or to delay. I did not flag the case for any additional review. I did not tell Valerie or anyone else on the foundation team who the applicant was. The treatment which my company had developed and which Oliver had helped us think about from the inside was administered according to the standard protocol in one of the infusion centers that participated in the foundation's network. It was effective. The clinical outcomes were within the expected range. The family member improved substantially over the first year of treatment. I do not know what Kyle Prescott thought about any of this. I don't know if he made the connection. I don't know if he ever understood, in any specific way, what the system that had covered his family member's treatment was, or who had built it. I don't know if that knowledge would have meant anything to him if he had it, or if he had the capacity, given everything about who he was and how he had grown up, to process it in any way beyond the immediate utility of the coverage. I never sought to tell him. This, I think, is the part of the story that most people don't anticipate. The assumption, when you're 17 and angry and carrying something heavy, is that the resolution of whatever is happening will involve some kind of recognition, some moment when the person who didn't see you correctly is forced, by circumstances, to see, some correction of the record witnessed by the person who wrote it wrong. That's not what happened, and I want to be honest about why not, because the reason is not magnanimity and it's not virtue, and it's not that I forgave him in any meaningful sense. The reason is simpler and more interesting than any of those things. I had built something real, something that was bigger than the origin story, something that was solving a genuine problem for real people who were not Kyle Prescott and had no relationship to him whatsoever. People like Oliver, people like the thousands of patients the foundation had served and would serve, people whose situations were structurally identical to what my family's situation had been when I was 15. The work had outgrown the wound. It had grown into something that had its own weight and its own momentum and its own justification that existed entirely independently of any particular person who had been wrong to me. To make the resolution about Kyle Prescott, to seek the recognition, to engineer the moment, to need him to understand what had happened, would have been to diminish what I had actually built. It would have been to reduce something that mattered to everyone it was serving into a vehicle for a personal score. I wasn't willing to do that. Not out of generosity toward him, but out of respect for what the work actually was. He would live the rest of his life without knowing, and I would live the rest of mine knowing. And the difference between those two positions, the difference in what each of us understood about the situation, was, in the end, consequence enough. I should tell you what the work costs, not the money. The money is what it is, a resource that has been substantial and has been applied and has produced what it produced. I mean the other costs, the ones that don't appear in financial statements. I am 37 years old now. The company has 84 employees and 2 approved therapies, and a pipeline with 3 additional compounds in clinical development. The foundation has served over 4,000 patients across 22 states. Oliver's condition has been well controlled for 6 years on our first therapy. He's one of the longer-term patients now, and his data contributes to our post-market surveillance program, which he finds amusing in the specific way he finds things amusing, which is not very expressively, but with complete sincerity. Angela retired 3 years ago. I will not tell you the details of what that involved, because they're private, except to say that she is not tired anymore. She tends a garden. She calls me every Sunday. She has a small dog of indeterminate breed that she adopted from a shelter, and whose name I can never remember, but which she talks about extensively and with obvious affection. She looks, when I see her, like a person who has been relieved of a sustained physical burden. That relief is the thing I'm most proud of, out of everything I've done, more than the clinical data, more than the regulatory filings, more than whatever position I occupy in whatever conversation someone is having about pharmaceutical access. My mother looks rested. I did that. But I am also, and I say this carefully because I want to be accurate rather than performative, significantly alone in the ways that the kind of person you have to become to build something like this tends to be alone. The relationships that didn't survive the process of becoming this were relationships that didn't survive. For reasons I understand, I was not easy to be with in the years when I was building. I was present the way a running engine is present, functional, reliable, generating heat, but not present in the way that relationships require. I was too far inside the problem. I was too permanently calibrated toward the horizon. The people who needed me to be more immediately available than I was able to be made the reasonable decision to find that availability elsewhere. I don't blame them. I understand exactly what they were responding to. There was a woman, I'll use the name Jessica from the whitelist, though that's not her real name and she has nothing to do with any of this story except as an example of what I'm describing, who I was involved with for 2 years, around year 3 and 4 of the company. She was a physician, which meant she understood the work in a way that most people don't, and she had her own demanding professional life, which meant she didn't require of me what someone in a less consuming role might have required. What she required, which was reasonable, was that some portion of my attention exist in the present tense rather than always in the service of the next milestone. That I be sometimes a person rather than a project. I couldn't do it consistently, not at that stage, not with the company at the place it was. The attention had to go somewhere, and the discipline I had developed over years of working under scarcity had calcified into a direction that I could redirect but not fully abandon. She left with characteristic directness. She told me exactly what she had observed, and exactly why it wasn't workable, and she wished me well with the work, and she meant both things sincerely. I didn't argue. I understood that she was describing something real. I've thought about her since, about what that relationship might have been with more available attention, but the available attention was going somewhere that was also real and necessary, and I am not able to reconstruct a version of events in which everything that needed doing got done and I was also easier to be with. Maybe that version exists. I haven't found it. The isolation came not as a dramatic condition, but as a structural feature, the natural outcome of organizing your life around a set of demands that leave diminishing room for everything else. You don't choose it exactly. You choose the thing that produces it, and then you live with both. I've thought about this often, about whether the cost was worth it, which is the wrong question, but is also unavoidably the question. I don't know how to answer it in the abstract. In the specific, I can tell you what it produced. A therapy that works, a foundation that covers people who can't cover themselves, a company that has demonstrated what the production economics of this category actually allow if you remove the pricing assumptions that the market had calcified. Those things exist. They will continue to exist after I'm gone. They will serve people who have no idea who I am and who will never know my name, which is exactly as it should be. That is what I built. It is larger than the thing that started me building. It would not exist if the thing that started me hadn't happened. That is the full accounting, and I am able to sit with the full accounting without needing it to add up differently than it does. I saw a photograph of Kyle Prescott recently. He was at some sort of industry event. I don't follow the industry press closely enough to know exactly which one. He was standing with a group of people, holding a drink, wearing a suit that was still good, but not what it would have been a decade ago. He looked in the photograph like a man who had rearranged his understanding of who he was without quite finishing the rearrangement. There was something in his posture that was still reaching for a position he no longer occupied. I looked at the photograph for a moment and then scrolled past it. I don't carry him with me the way I once carried him. What I carry now is different. It's the weight of what I've built and what it requires to maintain and where it still needs to go. That's a different kind of weight. heavier in some ways, lighter in others, more mine in the sense that it comes entirely from choices I made rather than from things that were done to me. I got a call last spring from a man I'll call Dr. Aaron Bennett, who runs a rare disease advocacy organization that has worked with the foundation for several years. He called to tell me that the foundation had been selected for a significant national award for patient access. It was the kind of award that generates press releases and gets read at galas and appears in annual reports. He was pleased and wanted to share the news. I thanked him. I told him I'd send someone from the Foundation's communications team to accept it at the ceremony, because I wouldn't be in town, which was not quite true, but was a reasonable-sounding version of the truth, which is that I'm not particularly interested in being the face of the thing. The thing is the thing. What I am is, at best, secondary. He said he hoped I'd reconsider, that my presence would mean something to the patient community. I said I'd think about it. What I thought, after I hung up, was about Oliver. About a Tuesday morning in October, a school hallway, a boy saying natural selection, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to think carefully about what those words would cost the people who heard them. About my mother's face during a late-night phone call she thought I wasn't listening to. About the specific quality of arithmetic that governs a life organized around a persistent medical emergency. I got a call last spring from a man I'll call Dr. Aaron Bennett, who runs a rare disease advocacy organization that has worked with the Foundation for several years. He called to tell me that the Foundation had been selected for a significant national award for patient access. It was the kind of award that generates press releases and gets read at galas and appears in annual reports. He was pleased and wanted to share the news. I thanked him. I told him I'd send someone from the Foundation's communications team to accept it at the ceremony, because I wouldn't be in town, which was not quite true, but was a reasonable-sounding version of the truth, which is that I'm not particularly interested in being the face of the thing. The thing is the thing. What I am is, at best, secondary. He said he hoped I'd reconsider, that my presence would mean something to the patient community. I said I'd think about it. What I thought after I hung up was about Oliver. About a Tuesday morning in October, a school hallway, a boy saying natural selection with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to think carefully about what those words would cost the people who heard them. About my mother's face during a late-night phone call she thought I wasn't listening to. About the specific quality of arithmetic that governs a life organized around a persistent medical emergency. And then I thought about something else, about what it would have meant to the version of me sitting in that school hallway at 17 to know that the system could be redesigned. Not circumvented, circumvention is the wrong frame. Not beaten, that's also the wrong frame, because it treats the system as an opponent rather than as a design, redesigned. That the architecture of how coverage decisions got made, of who had standing in regulatory processes, of what the production economics of biologics actually required versus what they were priced at. All of that could be studied and understood, and with sufficient time and resources and rigor altered. The 17-year-old version of me would have found that information useful. More than useful, it would have changed the specific texture of the despair. Because despair, I have come to understand, is not primarily a response to suffering. It is a response to the belief that the structure of the situation is fixed, that the numbers are the numbers and the system is the system, and what has been decided, and the only variable is how much of it you can absorb. What I know now that I did not know then is that the structure is never fully fixed. It has fixed-seeming components, regulatory frameworks, actuarial models, capital structures, contractual obligations that resist individual effort but respond to institutional effort. That the difference between absorbing a system and changing a system is almost entirely a matter of what kind of leverage you have and how long you're willing to work at precisely the right angles before you see movement. I think about that sometimes when I'm reviewing data on patients who are newly enrolled in the Foundation's programs. Each enrollment is a specific person with a specific history who is accessing something that they could not previously access. The reasons they couldn't access it previously are various: coverage gaps, cost sharing, prior authorization requirements, geographic access to specialty infusion facilities. The reasons are all different versions of the same underlying problem, which is that the system as it was designed was not designed with them in mind. We are changing that. Slowly, because slowly is how real change happens when it happens correctly. One formulary update, one regulatory consent order, one direct access enrollment at a time. It adds up. 4,000 patients is not a symbolic number. It is 4,000 specific people who are receiving treatment they were not receiving before. That number will grow, and has been growing, every quarter since we launched. And I got a call every Wednesday from my brother, who is one of those people, and who draws intricate geometric patterns in a sketchbook and designs clean, precise graphics for clients who respect the quality of his work and who is living, not as a story about what is possible when you fight hard enough, but as a person, specific and complicated and entirely his own, with his own relationship to what happened to him and his own understanding of what the years since have meant. That is enough. It has always been enough. I understood that earlier than I gave myself credit for, and it was enough then too, even when everything else was not. And then I thought about 4,000 patients, and the ones who will come after them, and the ones who will come after those. People I will never meet. People who will access the thing we built in the same way that people access infrastructure, without needing to know its history, without needing to know who built it or why or what it cost to build. Just there, usable, doing what it was built to do. That is what power looks like when you build it correctly. Not the press conference, not the confrontation, not the moment when the person who said the wrong thing in the school hallway finally understands what it led to. Just the system, running. Serving people it was built to serve. Doing what it was designed to do. That is what I built. And I wake up every morning, and I do it again. That's the part they don't show you in the stories about success and revenge and justice and the long game. They show you the confrontation and the reversal and the moment of recognition. They don't show you that the work is still there in the morning, that the emails still need to be answered, that the clinical data still needs to be reviewed, that there are still people whose coverage is being denied by someone somewhere who is doing the actuarial math and arriving at the wrong answer. I am 37 years old, and I am still doing the work. The work is not finished because work is never finished. It terminates into the next version of itself, and then into the version after that. And the measure of whether any of it meant anything is not whether it eventually arrived at completion, but whether the direction was right and whether the accumulation was real. I think the accumulation is real. I think the direction was right. I think most mornings that Oliver, drawing in his sketchbook on a Thursday morning in a school library, was worth more than the person who looked at him and said what he said. That worth was never in question, not in any moral sense. The question was whether it would ever be legible in the specific language that the world recognizes, the language of resources and structures and systems, and the power to determine who receives what. It's legible now. In 4,000 patient cases and counting. In a foundation that runs without needing to know why it was built. In a company that proved what the production economics actually allow. In a phone call every Wednesday with my brother. That's the full accounting. It doesn't add up to satisfaction. It adds up to something more durable than satisfaction. It adds up to evidence. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.